Consumerism, Identity in Our Society. What is consumerism? According to the academic Quentin Wheeler-Bell of Kent State University, consumerism is simply the process of consuming goods and occurs in any social situation in which individuals are exchanging and consuming goods and services. Thus, consumer societies have always and will always exist as long as humans are producing and consuming goods and services. Therefore, we cannot assume that the act of consuming itself is an issue. However, in the modern day, the term consumerism has taken on a new meaning as a shorthand for something much different and perhaps more detrimental: consumer capitalism. Consumer capitalism is defined by the same academic Quentin Wheeler-Bell as a particular type of society dominated by consumer lifestyles wherein a person's well-being and happiness depend to a large extent on the consumption habits. For brevity, I will refer to this concept by its shorthand, consumerism, throughout this video. So why talk about consumerism? Well, consumerism has been a controversial topic in the over a century since its emergence. There has been much debate over the meaning of consumerism. Some see it as benign, even beneficial and convenient, while others view it as a detriment and a threat to a thoughtful and genuine society. Regardless, consumerism has a profound effect on our society. It functions as a tool of capitalism in shaping our culture and selling identity as a commodity. Therefore, I feel it's important to identify the social paradigms of a consumerist culture and examine how this culture interacts with one's self-identity. Foremost, we must understand the structure of a consumerist society. Consumer capitalism, being capitalism, is inherently hierarchical. The means of production are privately owned. This means the tools used to produce, whether that be machinery, resources, or even TV stations, are owned and operated in the interests of a private entity, thus not necessarily in the interests of society as a whole. In the case of consumerism, the means of production are privately owned by large corporations and their shareholders. When speaking of consumerism, emphasis can be placed on the means of cultural production, as it is noteworthy in their replication of consumerist norms. That is all to say, essentially, that capitalists' interests, as represented through marketing and advertising, control the ways in which we think and how we interact with consumption. They do this by disseminating norms downward via media. Unfortunately, capitalism seeks profit maximization. Therefore, the norms engendered by agents of consumerism, such as the media, seek mainly to make money, often irrelevant of the benefit or harm to the consumer. Often this causes consumer capitalism to attempt to reconfigure social spaces and identity for the purpose of profit maximization. That is all to say, consumer capitalism tries to commodify previously non-economic areas of human life. However, before we dive deeper into how consumerism reshapes identity for profit, we must understand the concept of commodity fetishism, as it is arguably the most powerful paradigm of capitalism in perpetuating identity-based consumerism. Commodity fetishism is a term first coined by Karl Marx to describe the situation in which the identity of labor is invisible to the consumer. That is, the value of the labor utilized to create the consumable is not known to the consumer. Rather, the perceived value of the item is derived from an almost mythic and ostensibly axiomatic sense of worth. Implicit in this definition is also the irrational perception of intrinsic value in a commodity outside of its use value or usefulness. Instead, commodities are seen by their exchange value. That is what they can be exchanged for on a market. Their worth, then, is based upon conferred status and social meaning. Commodity fetishism is a potent tool in consumerism as it allows marketing to embalm products with exploitable social and cultural meaning. Commodification of identity. Under consumer capitalism, culture and identity are turned into commodities. Thus, as consumer goods are fetishized, one is able to seemingly actualize their self-identity through consumption of items imparted with an expressive lifestyle or social meaning. In this context, consumption represents the internalization and assimilation of the perceived qualities of the product into the consumer. Therefore, identity can be bought and sold. In this way, the relationship between culture, identity, and consumerism is a constant conversation in which consumption constructs and later validates the consumer's sense of self. The interconnecting processes just discussed translate into the inclination and capacity for consumerism to both create new culture, such as expressive individualism, as well as subsume and alter pre-existing culture. Often in the creation of new culture, marketing constructs new consumer identities in order to encourage new consumption practices. One of the most notable contemporary examples of this phenomenon is that of green consumerism. Green consumerism has been a rising trend within the last few decades. However, green consumerism resides in an awkward position within consumer culture. On one hand, green consciousness, that is, an awareness of the environmental impacts humans have on the natural world, is caught up in the discourse of sustainability. However, consumerism is often situated as an unsustainable practice. Therefore, according to the scholars Konstantin and Ionia Zaria, products seeking to appeal to a conscious demographic must be made green by being inscribed with a certain environmental morality. This process invokes the concept of commodity fetishism, as products are made green, thus meaningful to the consumer by embalming them with cultural meaning, in this case, sustainability and environmental awareness. In this process, a new category of consumer is created, the green consumer, whose identity is constructed through the deliberate consumption of green commodities. This consumer identity ties one's individual consumption practices into a larger theme of environmental ethics. In this way, green consumption indicates to others that one is both willing and able to buy products that will not contribute to environmental issues. Thus, one's identity as a moral and environmentally conscious individual is legitimized ostensibly through the consumptive practices. However, this commodification of identity does not always serve a seemingly beneficial purpose, such as in the case of green consumerism. Rather, and more often, it can serve the cause of oppression. Some argue that in the past few decades, consumerism has lost control of the meaning-making aspect of identity and now rather capitalizes on whatever culture is already available. This manifests in mining pre-existing cultural norms for commodifiable aspects. This facet of consumerism can be quite pernicious when it utilizes areas of historical inequality in search of profit. Gender is often an area exploited heavily by consumerism. This is illustrated in how consumer culture invokes long-established norms governing gender and employs them to sell goods. This slide gives a few examples of gendered marketing. However, to see the more dangerous side of this phenomenon, one can examine anorexia as a case study for how consumerism may reinforce gender depression. Anorexia nervosa is defined by the National Eating Disorder Association as an eating disorder characterized by weight loss and difficulties maintaining an appropriate body weight for one's height, age, and stature. In many individuals, this also includes heavily distorted body image. Explaining the cause of this disorder, Annamarie Ruelle of the University of Victoria theorizes that anorexia within women develops out of the symbolic meaning a culture assigns to female slenderness, fatness, and hunger. Thinness and fatness, while having no intrinsic meaning unto themselves, are given symbolic value through fetishization. These physical traits come to represent attractiveness and worth in the case of thinness and ugliness and shame in the case of fatness. Therefore, anorexia is not simply the refusal to become fat, but rather the refusal to embody the values culturally ascribed to fatness. This is key to understanding consumerism's role in anorexia. The pictures on this slide give a small representation of the cultural messages that create this attitude regarding weight. However, consumerism's use of gender does not end with weight. Within modern culture, consumption and the female body have become deeply intertwined. Images of attractive women are used to sell unrelated products such as cars, beers, and home appliances. Culturally, this often reduces the female body to an advertising tool. As a tool in advertisements, women's bodies are given economic value. This incentivizes women to consume goods, such as makeup or gym memberships, to improve their worth as a commodity. In this way, consumerist culture forces women to negotiate their identity as both a consumable and as a consumer. Thus, the results of this social paradigm often manifest in the harmful behaviors typical of anorexia. Another case study for understanding how consumerism can exploit pre-existing norms is the topic of fast fashion and its relationship to global economic power dynamics. Fast fashion is a term used to describe the business practices of stores such as H&M, Forever 21, and Zara, which prioritize easy profit maximization over quality or sustainability. This results in cheap, mass-produced, and easily disposable clothing. Clothing pictured on this slide are all examples of fast fashion. Fashion is often a means of externalizing one's self-identity. There is a great demand for trendy and identity-affirming clothing. Therefore, in many ways, the fashion industry is in the business of creating and selling identity. This slide gives examples of how clothing styles can say something about the identity the wearer wants to present. Someone who wears punk clothing may want to present themselves as cool or edgy, or maybe even as an outsider, while someone who wears prep clothing likely wants to show their bubbly and feminine identity through their clothing. And dressing sporty signals to others that you are athletic and perhaps nonchalant and easygoing. However, the acquisition of a wardrobe that affirms one's identity can be costly. This is where the concept of fast fashion arises. Sadly, the economic model of fast fashion hinges on outsourcing the production of these items to developing nations such as Indonesia, Bangladesh, Guatemala, Burma, Ethiopia, and other impoverished and/or formerly colonized nations. The reason for this is because these nations often have less powerful unions and thus less protections for workers. Therefore, exploitation is much easier and results in neo-colonial relationships wherein the economies of the producer nations are made subservient to the corporations serving the consumer economies of more powerful countries. To summarize what we've been over in this video, consumerism has a profound effect on our society. Under consumer capitalism, identity is commodified, which means that it is something that can be bought and sold. You can buy an identity, for example, by buying clothing that represents that identity. Personal identity can also be affected by consumer identity. Someone who only uses cruelty-free makeup, for instance, likely holds animal rights activism within their identity. This is accomplished by instilling consumables with a social meaning. This phenomenon can serve a good purpose, but more often than not, it only serves a profit motive.